The world of computing didn't start with encryption being built into it. We could easily say that computing started in the late 1940s. So from the 1940s up until the late 1970s, the idea of encrypting a mainframe computer just didn't make any sense whatsoever. Well, over time we began to discover, with the Cold War and things like that, that our computers, we didn't want people looking into them and figuring out the data, or we were moving data from one computer to another via phone lines or something, and we didn't want people to see that information, so we had to go about the process of encryption. Now, when you're encrypting in the IT world, you have to develop algorithms. Now, these algorithms, if you've been watching other episodes, number one, they have to be known to everybody. Everybody understands the algorithm, and they have to have a key of different lengths, and then that key has to be kept secret. So the first generation of encryptions, and we still see these today, use what were known as a symmetric key algorithm. Symmetric key simply means that the person who encrypts it needs the key, and then you take that key and the person who decrypts it uses the same key. It's the same key for encrypting and decrypting. Now that may seem obvious to you, but if you watch other episodes, you'll see there's other ways to do it. Anyway, so what we're going to be talking about are symmetric encryption algorithms, and what I want to stress is the idea of something called a block. Now, a symmetric block algorithm simply means that I don't care how much data you have, it takes off a chunk of data. So if it's a huge Word document, it takes off X amount of bytes at the beginning, it encrypts that, sends it off to the side, then grabs another block, encrypts that, sends it off to the side, and keeps going like that until it's all the way done. There's other ways to do it. So, the first type of popular symmetric block encryption ever created was known as the Data Encryption Standard, or DES. This was invented primarily by IBM, but other people contributed as well, and it developed as the first open standard used heavily by the United States government, and it's still in use today. Now, in other episodes, we've seen Caesar cipher and VJNA and even a simple XOR encryption. Let me show you how hairy a typical encryption is done using DES. The first step of DES encryption is to grab a 64-bit chunk of plain text from the data stream we wish to encrypt. We perform what's known as an initial permutation, a very specific stirring of the data. Okay, let's go ahead, now that we've done the initial permutation, and set the data aside for a moment, and let's look at the key. So here's our key. Now the first thing we're going to do is drop the last 8 bits off the key. We now split that key into two 28-bit chunks. We then grab the first 24 bits from each half and put them together, and we've created what's known as a subkey, which is 48 bits. Cool. All right. Now let's get back to our data. We're going to perform what's known as a Feistel function. It works kind of like this. We're going to take the 64 bits and split it into two 32-bit halves. We then set one of the halves aside, and we're only going to work on this one right here. So we're going to expand this half into a 48-bit chunk of data using an expansion function. We're then going to apply an XOR function to this using the subkey we've already generated. Next, we're going to use what are called S-boxes. In DES, X-boxes take in 64 bits and output 4 bits. There are 8 different S-boxes, and each one gives a different 4-bit output. So we apply the 8 S-boxes to the data, creating a 32-bit output. And then we're going to do what we call a final permutation. We then put the two 32-bit chunks back together, but backwards. And that completes a single Feistel function. That was fun, so let's do it again. We'll shift a few bits on the subkey, we'll split the data, set one aside, we go ahead and expand it, we XOR the subkey, we apply the S-boxes one more time, we throw in a permutation, and we put the data back together. Get the idea? Great. Let's do it 14 more times. Wow, seems a little complicated, right? Now keep in mind that what you just looked at was a very, very simplified overview of DES itself. It's actually a lot more complicated than that, but that'll at least get you to the idea. Isn't it cool that we can go through this wildly complicated process, and using the same key, we can decrypt, basically reverse the process, and encrypt. We can go either direction. It's absolutely fascinating. Now, as wildly complicated as that was, there were a couple of issues with DES. Number one, the big problem with DES more than anything else was its short key. Now, 56 bits sounds like a long key to you and me, but in reality, it's actually kind of short. and it allowed it to become exposed to certain types of attacks. So by the early 1990s, people were saying that we could hack DES. And now in the post-2010, 2020, not that far away, DES can be hacked in certain circumstances. So even way back in the 90s, they started to come up with alternatives. Two of the alternatives you may see. One of them is called Blowfish, and the other one is called Triple DES. Now, the thing I want to stress to you is that when we're talking about symmetric block encryptions, there are three things we tend to talk about more than anything else. We talk about the key size, how long the key is. We talk about the number of rounds, how many rounds does it go through in its encryption process. And then we also talk about the block size. So let's go through Blowfish and Triple DES compared to DES. Okay, so let's go ahead and put DES in. We know DES is a block cipher. Now, it uses a 64-bit block size. It runs 16 rounds with a key size of 56 bits. I know we say 64, but we take 8 bits off for overhead, so it's really 56 bits. Now, Triple DES was also a block encryption, also with a 64-bit block size. It also had 16 rounds. But basically what it did is it repeated the DES process 3 times. So you had 3 56-bit keys. So in essence, you had a 168-bit key. Blowfish had a 64-bit block size. It ran 16 rounds, and the key size was variable. It could be as low as 32 bits and as high as 448 bits. By the early 1990s, it was obvious to the United States federal government that DES wasn't very good, Blowfish wasn't under their control, and Triple DES was really just kind of a patch together. And so the National Institute of Standards in the very late 1990s and continuing into the early 2000s started a big competition. They called it a competition, but it was really almost more of like a conference, like a big get-together, because we'd have people from the private sector and the public sector and from academia all submitting these new symmetric block encryptions, which were going to replace all this stuff. And they kind of worked together. So they called it a competition, but there was a lot of teamwork. And we started off with a few hundred submissions, and they got it down to like 12, then they got it down to 5. And then from the top 5, they basically took a vote, because all of the top 5 were very, very good. And one particular algorithm called Reindahl became the new, what's now known as the Advanced Encryption Standard in the early 2000s. Now, the Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES, yes, of course, it's a symmetric block encryption, but what's most important about it is that it is, even though it's well over 10 years old, in fact, maybe getting closer to 20 these days, it is, in essence, still unhackable. I'll knock on wood on that, and it is an incredibly powerful symmetric encryption. Now, I'm not even going to bother to try to show you the details of how AES works on the inside, so let's just put that on our chart so that we know the key sizes, and we know the block sizes, and we know the number of rounds. So, AES, obviously this is a block algorithm. It has a block size of 128 bits. Now let's jump over to the key size, because you could have 3 different key sizes. You can have 128, 192, or 256-bit keys. Basically, the bigger the key, the more secure you are. And now going back to rounds, we would have either 10, 12, or 14 rounds, depending on whether you had 128, 192, or 256-bit key sizes. Now, there is one exception to the world that sounds pretty much dominated by symmetric block ciphers. There is another way to do it using what we call streaming ciphers. So instead of taking a chunk, encrypting that, and sending it off, taking a chunk, encrypting it, and sending it off, you can do what's known as streaming. Now, in a streaming scenario, what you'll do is you'll have, as each bit comes out of through a wire or something like that, so we use this in communication a lot, it literally will encrypt 1 bit at a time, randomly making it a 1 or a 0. Well, it's not random, it's called pseudo-random, but it will create it in such a way that it literally encrypts 1 bit at a time. So to make this easy for us, there really is only one type of streaming symmetric encryption out there, and that's known as RC4. So let's throw him on the list too. So RC4 is a streaming type of encryption. It really doesn't use block sizes. It's 1 bit at a time. And because it only gets to see that bit once, there's only 1 round when you're using that streaming encryption. And the key size, and this is often the case, if you don't have a lot of rounds, you often want to use really big keys. So the key size can be as small as 40 bits and can go up to 2048 bits. You have gone through a lot of different types of symmetric encryptions here. Now, the thing about algorithms you need to understand is that at no time are you going to have to set these things up. Really, we live in a world where we have these already programmed in, and we're going to cover this in other episodes. But to give you one example, we've probably all done wireless networks. If you set up your wireless access point to use WPA encryption, you're actually using RC4. Whereas if you set it up for WPA2, you're actually using AES encryption. So it's not so terribly important to me that you know the real complete detailed difference between, say, DES and triple DES. What is important is that you have a rough understanding of these types of encryptions. You need to understand that they are all symmetric, they all share the same key, and then also they can either be block, most of them are block, and with the exception of RC4 can be streaming. So you're going to want to take a moment to memorize that type of stuff. But the cool part is that while we understand that, we take advantage of systems that are pre-built in, so when we make choices at a higher level, it's going to help determine the type of encryption that we're going to use.